Hello, my name is Mackenzie, and welcome to my podcast, Crime on the Clarkfork, where I tell you about big crimes that happen in small places. Each case that I will cover on this podcast have occurred in areas with populations of 15,000 or less. The reason I'm doing this podcast is because I grew up in a small town in western Montana, and I'm also a huge true crime fan. The problem? Whenever I suggest a case that happened in my town or another like it, they don't get covered. I assume it's because they aren't as sensationalized as cases in bigger cities. So, that's when I came up with the idea of only covering cases that happen in small places, because the crimes are just as big. The sources for this week's episode are the Cal Alumni Association, the Bassett Family Association Database, HistoryLink.org, HistoricalCrimeDetective.com, FamilySearch.org, Unknown Gender History, FindAGrave.com, the Winona Republican Herald, Montana Moments, World Population Review, and the Montana Standard. This week, the murders of Shoebox Annie and her son, C.C. Skidmore. Let's get into it. Anaconda, Montana, 1921, population 11,700. In March of 1921, a woman named Dorothy Casse mysteriously disappeared. At the time of her disappearance, Dorothy was a 23-year-old woman and stood at 5'4". She weighed less than 100 pounds and had auburn hair and brown eyes. She had recently married her husband, Ernest Casse, less than 5 months earlier, in December of 1920. Interestingly, Dorothy was no stranger to C.C. Skidmore, the son of Shoebox Annie, and one of the killers in this story. In 1917, Dorothy and her previous husband had been caught and arrested for stealing a car with Skidmore in Bozeman, Montana. At this time, Dorothy went by the name of Ira C. Petrie. All three of the people committing this crime, Ira, aka Dorothy, Mr. Petrie, her husband at the time, and Skidmore, her murderer, were all convicted for the crime and sent to the Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, Montana. The kicker, Ira, aka Dorothy, was paroled and never went to the Montana State Prison to serve a sentence. Fast forward to 1921, the year Dorothy disappeared. There was rumored to be tension between Dorothy's new husband, Ernest, and Skidmore. This was backed up by a Butte police report that stated that the two men had been in a fight over Dorothy a few months prior to her disappearance. Skidmore ended up in jail due to this altercation, and during this time, his mother, Shoebox Annie, visited him frequently. Shoebox Annie was born on October 28, 1865 in Auburn, Pennsylvania, as Mary Eleanor Smith. In 1892, she married her husband, John M. Mayer, and soon after, in 1894, they had their first and only child, DeCasto Earl Mayer, who was born in New York. There's not a lot of information on Mary or DeCasto prior to their crimes, including what landed them in Montana, but growing up, DeCasto had a criminal record, especially when it came to automobile theft, as stated earlier in his crime with Dorothy. Over his life, he had served time in state prisons in Oregon, Montana, Colorado, and Utah, as well as city jails in LA, Seattle, Spokane, Portland, and Denver. His mother, Shoebox Annie, got her nickname due to her time in Anaconda, Montana during the Prohibition in the 1920s. At the time, she lived in a one-story home on East Commercial, and she would walk around town carrying a shoebox filled with odds and ends she would sell, including soap, shoelaces, and her bootleg moonshine, as it was the Prohibition. It is also rumored that she had a pet magpie at this time that she would bring with her on her outings to sell door to door, and if someone would let them into her house, her magpie was trained to pick up valuables from dressers and counters and fly out of the house with them. The only way people were able to get Annie out of their house was to purchase something from her box. Shoebox Annie and her son, DeCasto, also had many aliases that they used during their time as criminals. Annie had been known also as Jenny Stahl, Mary French, and Mary Eleanor Smith, her birth name. Her son was also one with many names, which included William Earl Mayer, C.D. Montaigne, Charles C. Skidmore, C.C. Skidmore, and Earl Montaigne. For the rest of this podcast, I'll be using the names Shoebox Annie, or Annie, for Mary Eleanor Smith, and Skidmore for her son DeCasto, to relieve any confusion. With this background information, let's get back to their crimes. After Dorothy's disappearance in March of 1921, her husband, Ernest, was convinced that Skidmore had something to do with his wife's disappearance. The month after Dorothy went missing, Ernest went to the newspapers where he claimed that then 28-year-old Skidmore had murdered his wife. At the time of the article being released, Skidmore was actually being held in Butte jail as a suspect of a robbery. At the time of his arrest for this crime, he was in possession of 2 of Dorothy's trunks that were full of valuables that included furs, jewelry, and her clothes. They had also found even more of her possessions in a safety deposit box that was registered to Skidmore. After this news article was released, Dorothy's mother, J.A. Hendricks, came to Montana from her home in Texas. Once in Anaconda, she arrived at Shoebox Annie's home with Ernest. The two were invited inside by Annie to discuss the missing Dorothy when suddenly Hendricks pulled out a handgun, pointed it at Annie, and told her that she would kill the woman unless she told her where her daughter was. Shoebox Annie stood her ground and said that she did not know where her missing daughter was. Unhappy with this response, Hendricks pulled the trigger, hitting Annie once in the chest, once in the arm, and missed on her 3rd shot. After the attack, Ernest and Hendricks walked out of the house and calmly started heading to the local police station. Neighbors had heard the shots and called the police, who were already on their way when the couple had left Annie's home. Dorothy's mother was then jailed for this crime, and Annie spent time in the hospital to recover from her wounds. Skidmore and Annie continued to deny having any knowledge of what happened to Dorothy after this incident. Due to the lack of evidence that Skidmore had anything to do with Dorothy's disappearance, he was soon released from the Butte jail. His mother was also released from the hospital after recovering from her gunshot wounds during this time. And due to the amount of eyes on the two because of this disappearance, they all packed up their things and moved to Pocatello, Idaho. Even though the police believed they had the culprits of Dorothy's disappearance, they didn't have any hard evidence to prove it, specifically the body. Even so, throughout the investigation into the two, another disappearance was tied to the mother-son duo from the fall of 1920. The disappearance of Ole Larson. Ole Larson was a 68-year-old Anaconda man when he disappeared. He was a lime mixer at the local quarry just west of town. In late fall of 1920, Larson had made an appointment to meet Skidmore and Annie in the town of Anaconda. Prior to this meeting with the two, he was seen in town and known to have taken out $800 in the form of a draft on a Salt Lake bank. This is equivalent to taking out over $12,500 in 2024. After the draft was taken, Ole Larson was never seen again. A few days after his disappearance, a woman called the hotel at which Larson was supposed to be staying at the time and said that he was going to be gone for several days as he had gone away on a trip. After the phone call, the $800 draft was cashed by none other than Shoebox Annie with a forged signature of Ole Larson on the back in the handwriting of Skidmore, although at the time they did not know that it was forged. Around the time of Dorothy's disappearance, neighbors to Shoebox Annie and her son in Goosetown said that they had heard screams for help in a woman's voice that woke them in the middle of the night. But as they got to their doors to look outside, all was silent. There were also reports of Dorothy entering the house, but never emerging. Furthermore, after the disappearance of Larson, a couple of months prior in the fall of 1920, Skidmore had a square copper vat constructed for him from a tin shop in Anaconda. Shortly after the vat made its way into Shoebox Annie and her son's home, neighbors were awoken from their slumber yet again, but this time to a foul odor. The stench persisted through the morning, and as the neighbors looked onto the house of the mother-son pair, they were met with a sight of thick, black smoke billowing from the home's chimney. Neighbors filed reports with the local police, and an officer was sent to the home the following day to look into the reports of the smoke. When the officer arrived, Annie had told him that they were simply cleaning up and didn't want to build a fire outside so as to not smoke out their neighbors. Later in the investigations, authorities were planning on speaking to Skidmore about the smoke, as well as the disappearance of Dorothy and Larson, but he was unable to be found. Another terrifying tale to come out of the small house in Anaconda was that of a woman who survived the terror of Shoebox Annie and her son. The woman claimed to have entered the house and was led into an interior room without windows. She stated that the walls and the door were padded to make the room soundproof, muffling her cries for help. The door itself was bolted from the outside. She was a prisoner in this room, but she wasn't alone. There was another person in the room with her, a burly man. The woman fought and screamed for nearly an hour before Shoebox Annie released her, assuming she was too much of a liability, and told her to keep her trap shut about the situation that had just unfolded in the house. Who was the man in there with her? That part's unknown. 2 years after the disappearance of Dorothy Casse, the skeletal remains of a woman were found near Homestake Pass in Montana. The police were hopeful that they had found the body of Dorothy, but a positive identification was not able to be made at that time. With the body was a suicide note that read, "If by chance I am found, please, please leave my body in the spot where you found it. Do not take me out of the mountains. I love them." Unsurprisingly, the handwriting on the note was awfully similar to the handwriting on the back of the forged draft signed by Skidmore back in 1920. Also, within 18 hours of the body being found, Skidmore had disappeared from his home in Idaho. In the years between the disappearance of Dorothy and the discovering of her body on Homestake Pass, Skidmore had been put behind bars for car theft charges. Surprise, surprise. He had been working in the black market where he would sell stolen cars, specifically Fords. He was skilled at auto theft and he had specialized tools that allowed him to change serial numbers on vehicles. Once the body was found and Skidmore was released from jail from his most recent stint, him and his mother relocated once again from Pocatello, Idaho to Seattle, taking on different names. Shoebox Annie returned to a name close to her birth name, Eleanor Smith, and Skidmore returned to his birth name of DeCasto Earl Mayer. After the move, Skidmore was arrested in 1926 once again and sentenced to 3 years in Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas for violating the Mann Act of 1910, which made it illegal to transport a female in interstate commerce for immoral acts. He served 2 of his 3 years of sentence before being released on parole on July 31st, 1928. Once released, he returned to Seattle to once again commit crimes with his mother, Shoebox Annie. Unfortunately, they took up crime again in 1928 in the state of Washington. It was September and Annie and Skidmore happened across a naval officer named James Eugene Bassett, a World War I Army Air Corps veteran. Bassett was originally from Baltimore and attended the U.S. Naval Academy. In July of 1928, Bassett decided to drive his brand new 1929 Chrysler 75 Roadster from his home in Maryland to the Puget Sound region, where his sister lived. He arrived in mid-August and stayed with his sister, her husband, and their son at the Naval Shipyard in Bremerton. Bassett was a professional stenographer and had been hired by the Department of the Navy as a civilian secretary. He was assigned to the U.S. Naval Headquarters at Cavite in Manila Bay. Due to this new assignment in the Philippines, Bassett placed an ad in a local newspaper to sell his vehicle, rather than shipping it to Manila with him. Not long after the ad was placed, Bassett was contacted by a man named Mr. Clark who wanted to look at the vehicle. Mr. Clark arrived in Bremerton on September 4th, 1928 to look at the Chrysler. Clark told Bassett that the vehicle was exactly what he was looking for, but needed to show it to his aunt, who lived in Seattle. He told Bassett that if his aunt liked the Roadster, he would be ready to purchase the vehicle with a certified check in the amount of $1,600. Due to Bassett needing to leave in a couple of days to make his way to this new post, he agreed to bring the Chrysler to Seattle for Mr. Clark's aunt to take a look so he could close the deal. The following day, September 5th, Bassett left Bremerton with the Roadster and took a ferry to Seattle. He told his brother-in-law that he would be back later that day. Around 6 p.m. that evening, Bassett's sister, Emily, received a telegram from her brother stating that he had met a friend and was going to Vancouver, Canada with them until Friday. This struck his sister as odd because Bassett had no known friends in the Pacific Northwest. It was completely out of character for him to do something like this, and he hadn't taken any luggage with him when he went to go sell his car. His sister said that he was a man of exemplary habits and that she couldn't believe that he would leave a city suddenly. When he failed to return to his sister's home in Bremerton that Friday, September 7th, and then missed his ship to Manila the following day, his brother-in-law requested that the captain look for Bassett on the steamship before it took sail, as well as looking again once they reached a stopover in Vancouver, Canada, in case he was on the ship and they just didn't realize it. Unfortunately, he was not aboard during either of these extra sweeps. Bassett's family was also informed that the Canadian authorities had no record of his very distinctive Roadster crossing the border, and that they had found no trace of him at any Vancouver hotel during his supposed Canada trip with his friend. On Sunday, September 9th, Bassett's brother-in-law went to the Seattle Police Headquarters and convinced the Chief of Detectives, Captain Charles Tennant, that Bassett had met foul play. Chief Tennant sprung into action immediately and assigned detectives to investigate into the disappearance as well as where the Roadster could have ended up. Bassett's disappearance was written about in the newspapers the following day, that Monday, and the Roadster was found to have been seen at the Capitol building on the Thursday previous with a man who had a typed bill of sale that was notarized in Seattle. The bill of sale transferred the ownership of the vehicle from Bassett to, you probably guessed it, Casse Mayer, aka Skidmore. Skidmore had been accompanied to the Capitol building by an elderly woman who he introduced as his mother. They purchased Washington license plates for their new ride and were seen changing the Maryland plates to their new Washington plates outside the Capitol building. When the notary was contacted, he stated that Bassett and Mr. Clark visited his office on Wednesday, September 5th, to authenticate Bassett's signature on a blank bill of sale. Mr. Clark stated that the bill of sale would be filled in later once the purchase was finalized. The following day, it was found that a man using the name D.E. Mayer hired a public stenographer to fill in the rest of the missing information with her typewriter. Once satisfied that Mr. Clark and Skidmore were the same person, a nationwide alert was sent out for the automobile with the request that it be seized as evidence and the occupants be held for suspicion of murder. On September 13th, just 3 days after Bassett was declared missing, a male and elderly female driving a blue 1929 Chrysler Roadster were stopped by motorcycle traffic officers as they were entering Oakland, California. The police officer stepped into the right running board and told the man to drive the car to police headquarters. On the way to the police headquarters, the man attempted to knock the officer off of the running board by rear-ending a car, sideswiping another, and driving erratically. Due to this, the officer pulled his gun and threatened to shoot the driver if he didn't obey his orders to go to the police headquarters without further incident. Once they arrived at police headquarters, the driver identified himself as, again, you probably guessed it, Casse Mayer, aka Skidmore. He told the officers that he was an ex-convict and used multiple aliases, at least 12, throughout the years. The elderly woman in the passenger seat would not cooperate with authorities, refusing to answer any questions asked of her. Eventually, she was identified as Mary Eleanor Smith, or as we know her, Shoebox Annie. When officers began looking at the possessions that Skidmore and Annie had in the vehicle with them, they found Bassett's wallet with his driver's license and vehicle registration in it, a Yellowstone National Park souvenir buckle, a watch with Bassett's name engraved on it, and cufflinks, all belonging to Bassett. Among those belongings, they also found a loaded tear gas gun and a box of cartridges for the weapon, as well as a scrapbook that was filled with information about unusual murders in the United States and clippings from detective magazines. The gun itself was worrisome, as detectives stated that such a weapon could kill multiple people with one shot without leaving a trace to point to murder. When asked about Bassett's belonging in the vehicle, the duo said that they hadn't noticed the items until after the sale had taken place, and at that time, they didn't know how to contact Bassett to return those items. The pair was arrested and charged with grand larceny and put on $25,000 bonds. The problem? Bassett was missing, but there was no evidence that he was deceased. To ensure the pair was kept in custody, a federal grand jury in Seattle indicted them both for violation of the Dyer Act. During the search for Bassett, a Seattle dentist, Dr. James Clark, came forward stating that he had leased out a house for the year to none other than Skidmore and Annie. When the residence was searched, police found a .30 caliber handgun that was fitted with a silencer, a box of ammunition, and Bassett's Maryland license plates. They also found newspapers on the kitchen table with advertisements for vehicles for sale circled. Finally, they found remains of burnt clothing and buttons with the ashes that remained in the stove and fireplace of the residence. The police also dug in and around the house, but not a trace of Bassett was found. Other people had come forward during this time and stated that they had similar experiences with a man calling himself Mr. Clark when they were attempting to sell their vehicles in the Seattle area. On December 28, 1928, the pair were escorted from San Francisco, where they had been being held, to the Seattle City Jail, where they were held in solitary confinement. During their time at the Seattle City Jail, the pair stayed silent. Frustrated with their silence, Chief Tenant used truth serum on the duo in hopes that they would confess to the murder of Bassett. At this time, Skidmore and Annie were being defended by a Seattle attorney, John F. Dorr. After the third-degree interrogation method used by Tennant was discovered, Dorr filed a writ of habeas corpus for the release of his clients and charged the Seattle Police Department with cruelty and torture. While Tennant denied the charges against him, the pair was still transferred from the Seattle City Jail to the King County Jail. After their transfer on October 25, 1928, The Superior Court judge denied the writ of habeas corpus, but did grant a writ of mandamus, which ordered that the two must be given a preliminary hearing regarding their charges of grand larceny within 72 hours of the ruling. The judge has also issued a restraining order that prohibited the police from using any form of violence or torturous method on the mother-son duo. 2 days later, the pair were granted their preliminary hearing. Each had 2 counts of grand larceny filed against them, one for the theft of the roadster and another for the theft of the wristwatch, belt, and cufflinks that belonged to Bassett. Both pled not guilty, and their trial date was set for December 5th. When December 5th rolled around, the trial for the two began with jury selection. The selection took less than a day and was composed of 12 men and 2 alternates. All jurors were impaneled and sworn in. The pair's defense attorney, Dorr, made a motion to suppress all material evidence that had been collected, claiming that it had been seized illegally. The judge, Steinhardt, stated that when evidence was presented in the trial, he would rule on them individually. The following day, opening statements were made. The prosecuting attorney, named Colvin, spent 2 hours outlining the state's complicated chain of circumstantial evidence against Skidmore and Annie. When it came to the defense's turn to speak, the defense counsel, also known as Agnew, simply stated that the prosecution had no victim to prove that any larceny had taken place, and therefore they had no case. He went on to say that the defense had no witness to call at this time. The trial went on for several days, where the prosecution called a total of 71 witnesses to testify against the mother-son pair. After 8 days, the prosecution rested its case. Agnew, the defense counsel, immediately moved for directed verdicts of not guilty for his clients, stating that the state had insufficient evidence to support their claims of larceny. The judge denied this motion, stating that the state had enough circumstantial evidence to warrant the case being sent to jury to decide. After Agnew once again stated that the defense had no witnesses to testify, the judge gave instructions to the jury and moved on to final arguments. Colvin reviewed the evidence against the defendants that proved that they had schemed to steal Bassett's vehicle and personal items, and urged the jury to find the pair guilty. On the other hand, Agnew continued to argue that the state only had circumstantial evidence and pleaded with the jury to vote for an acquittal. After deliberating for only 2 hours, 90 minutes of which was dinner, on December 14th, the jury reached a verdict. The jury had found Skidmore and Annie guilty for 2 counts of grand larceny each. 1 month later, on January 11th, 1929, Prosecutor Colvin charged Skidmore with violation of Washington State's Habitual Criminal Act due to the fact that he had at least 3 felony convictions, including one in Washington State. If found guilty, Skidmore would be sentenced to life in prison. The charges went to trial, where Skidmore pleaded not guilty, but in the end, the jury found him guilty of this crime after only 20 minutes of deliberation, landing him life in prison without the possibility of parole in Washington State Penitentiary. On February 7th, 1929, Annie appeared before the judge, and she was sentenced to serve 5 to 10 years in the Washington State Penitentiary. At this time, Agnew told the court that Annie decided to appeal to the Washington State Supreme Court for a new trial. When Skidmore heard of the appeal of his mother and realized that an overturned conviction would negate his life sentence he was given, he wrote Agnew asking him to appeal the case to the Supreme Court as well. Agnew went on to argue for both appeals on October 16, 1929, stating that there was error by the judge in the original trial and insufficient evidence to prove larceny. The Supreme Court judges took the case under advisement and told Agnew that they would offer a ruling on a later date. During this time, there was still a search for Bassett's body. Prosecutor Colvin and King County Sheriff Claude Bannock decided that they would do whatever it took to find the missing man. They decided that they would ignore the legal consequences and subjected Skidmore to 6 days of limited sleep, more truth serum, lie detector tests, and making him wear an organ boot. For 8 hours a day, Skidmore was strapped to a lie detector and questioned about the location of Bassett's body. Annie was also subject to questioning with the lie detector and truth serum, but not the other extremes that her son went through. After 5 days, Skidmore asked to speak to Colvin in private. Once alone, Skidmore confessed to the murderer of Bassett, stating, "I know what the machine is. I know it's recording the truth. I can't beat it. Let's not kid each other. You and everybody else knows that I killed Bassett. What will you do for me if I come clean?" He also agreed to show them where the body was. Unfortunately, This never happened, as Skidmore recanted his confession, saying he knew that the confession would never be able to be used against him. After the 6 days of interrogation, Agnew filed an injunction which prohibited the further use of torture on either of his clients. The judge agreed that the methods used against the couple were against their constitutional rights against cruel and unusual punishment, and due to this, a restraining order was issued by the judge that prohibited any questioning to happen without Agnew present. On December 17, 1929, the Washington State Supreme Court affirmed the charges against Skidmore, but reversed Annie's based on a technicality, which granted her a new trial. The retrial of Annie began on April 21, 1930. The defense argued that Annie was not her son's accomplice to the crimes and knew nothing of his criminal activities. According to Agnew, Annie had no idea that the vehicle was stolen and was surprised when they were pulled over and arrested for Bassett's murder. The prosecution rested on April 25th, and Annie went on to the witness stand to testify on her own behalf. Agnew attempted to prove that Annie was mentally ill as a result from the truth serum and lie detector tests used on her while in prison, but Colvin, the prosecutor, argued that Agnew was attempting to create a smokescreen to avoid the real issues of the trial. The judge agreed and had all testimony about the truth serum and lie detectors stricken from the record. After a couple more witnesses that were just as ineffective as Annie, the defense rested its case. On April 26th, the case went to the jury where they deliberated for just over 2 hours once again, and when they returned, they stated that they had found Annie guilty of grand larceny, and the judge sentenced her to serve 5 to 8.5 years at the Washington State Penitentiary. She intended to file another appeal, but it was dismissed. For nearly 10 years after their arrests, the pair were silent. That is, until May 5th, 1938, days before Annie was eligible for parole, she confessed. Her cellmate, Margaret Fawcett, had been her confidant, and she saw an opportunity for clemency if she managed to get Annie to confess to the murders. Fawcett went to the prison matron and told her what Annie had said about the murders. The prison matron, named Nixdorf, suggested that Fawcett convince Annie to write details of the crime in a letter. But since all prisoner mail was screened, Nixdorf also told Fawcett to tell Annie that the letters would be smuggled out of the prison, away from the eyes of the law. Annie wrote many letters which she then gave to Fawcett, which were then quickly handed to Nixdorf. Once there were enough letters to confront her with, Warden Macaulay went to Shoebox Annie with a 4-page letter that had a complete account of Bassett's murder. Annie admitted that the handwriting was hers and the facts in the letter were true. The next day, she signed a formal confession that repeated the details of the murder. In the letters, she claimed that her son was responsible for the deaths of 4 people: Dorothy Casse, Ole Larson, James Bassett, and a man from Pocatello, Idaho named Dave Randall. After the confession of Shoebox Annie, the duo was brought face to face for the first time since their joint trial 10 years prior. Skidmore continued to claim his innocence, stating that his mother had gone goofy, but Annie had a story to tell. On the day of Dorothy's disappearance in March of 1921, Annie claimed that Skidmore had brought Casse to their home in Anaconda, Montana, and she had stayed all night. The next morning, while Dorothy was asleep, Annie claims that her son shot the woman. Annie then went to the store after the murder, and when she returned, Skidmore had brought Dorothy's body to the kitchen and cut her body into several pieces. He had also crushed her skull. After dark, the pair put part of Casse's body in a suitcase and wrapped the rest, whatever that means. They then drove 1.5 miles towards Butte from their home and threw the remain of Dorothy into a ditch that ran from the Anaconda smelter to Warm Springs. When it comes to Ole Larson, Annie also gave up information on his mysterious disappearance. She stated that she had gone to Ole Larson's place with her shoebox of items, and he had purchased shaving soap. She said he took out a large roll of money. I saw Earl and told him about the money a day or so later. Earl started for Larson's house, but he met him in front of the bank. He told Larson I wanted to see him on business, and Larson came to the house. She went on to recall the murder of Larson, which occurred in the same way as Dorothy. Skidmore took Larson into the bedroom, shot him, dismembered the body, and the couple waited until the darkness of night and threw the remains into the ditch 1.5 miles from their home. Finally, the confession of Bassett's murder. This is what Annie wrote in her signed confession. She wrote, "I'm going to tell you the truth. The automobile was advertised for sale by Eugene Bassett, who was on his way from Maryland to take a position in Manila. He was visiting his sister's home on the Navy Yards at Bremerton near Seattle. Her husband was Commodore Winters. Earl answered the ad and went over to see Bassett at his sister's home. It was on September 5th, 1928, but being Labor Day, did not transact business until the next day. It was a most beautiful car, and he wanted it as he had two very good positions offered by real estate men, one by Charles Hallman. He came home and told me this. As I was getting my divorce from Smith at that time, I had not yet seen the car, so he told me he was going to bring Bassett to our house the next day and do away with him. We took Dr. J. W. Clark's house for this kind of purpose, as we knew whatever car we got, we would have to do away with the owner, and this was an ideal spot for that purpose. Earl went and got him on the morning of the 6th, took him to a notary public office for the purpose of making believe he wanted a bill of sale. While there, Earl said we could not close the deal until he spoke to his mother, and she would have to write out the check. We brought him home, and I was sitting on the couch where I had a rod of iron hidden in a quilt in case of a struggle. We also had the phone removed. Every precaution was taken. When we said we would pay in check, Bassett consented and said he was okay with it. I got up from the couch and sat down at the writing desk. Earl gave me a hint to leave the room. Bassett sat in the chair in front of the fireplace as I stepped into the kitchen. Earl stepped up behind Bassett and handed him a blank telegram and said, "I am going to have your car and I won't pay for it. You write this telegram as I write it." Bassett refused, but Earl said, "You write it or I'll kill you." So he wrote as follows. Mrs. Commodore Williams, Navy Yard, Bremerton, Washington. I have sold my car, met a friend, and am going to Vancouver for 3 days. Signed, Jean. As Earl took the telegram, he picked up a hammer and hit Bassett on the head. I heard his body fall and went in as he was gurgling. I stepped out and Earl gave one blow and it was all over. We dragged the body into the bathroom, undressed it, and put the body in the bathtub where he dissected it at once. I cleared the mess and burned the clothes, and the scalp also was burned. Earl was so sick and weak, I gave him eggnog to keep him up. At night we took the pieces of the body, minus the head and hands, and drove way out to a big patch of woods somewhere between Cathcart and Bothell, and put them under some brush clump. The next morning we took the hands and head miles away to another patch of woods and buried the hands on one side of the road at a distance, and the head on the other side of an old abandoned woodchuck hole at arm's length. This is all about the Bassett case. On top of this confession, more evidence came out about the Bassett case when a man, Casse Schmidt, told officials about his day on Wednesday, September 5th. He said he was with his son, Julius, driving on the Bothell-Everett Highway in Washington, when a bright blue Chrysler Roadster passed them at high speed. When the Roadster attempted to take an exit, they ended up in a ditch. The Schmidts pulled over to offer assistance and noticed the Maryland license plates. When they made it to the car and looked inside, they saw 2 full gunny sacks that looked like they were covered in blood sitting in the rumble seat. They also noticed a shovel tied to the side of the vehicle. The 2 in the car ignored the Schmidts' help and sped away, turning off their headlights. Schmidt found this interaction really odd, so he wrote down the license plate number, which was then used as evidence in the murder trial. When it came to their 4th victim, Randall, Annie never confessed to the details of that murder other than saying her son did it. After confessing to the murders, she went on to say that while her son would dismember the bodies, he worked very hard and she would make him eggnog to keep up his strength, which she had written in her written confession as well. But she had also said that the crimes that were committed by her son were never malicious, but simply because he needed money or a car to start his life, and I quote, he never let his victims suffer. Unfortunately, the bodies of their victims were never found. Even after a very intense search in Anaconda, Montana, the authorities ended up empty-handed. They think the bodies may have been buried in slag piles, and by the time the confessions happened, they would have been buried under thousands of tons of slag. After the confession of his mother was read to Skidmore again, he admitted that what was written was substantially correct, but he refused to make a written confession. He did, however, sign a statement that he had decided to plead guilty to the murder of Bassett, which he later repudiated, but it was still able to be used as evidence against him at trial. Due to the signed confessions from his mother and his voluntary signature on the guilty plea, Skidmore and Annie were charged with premeditated murder for the murder of Bassett. But in 1938, Just days before the trial, Skidmore committed suicide in his jail cell at the age of 43. His mother, Shoebox Annie, pled guilty to the murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. She was released from prison in March of 1953 due to her declining health and a lack of resources for care for her at the prison. She was immediately transferred and confined to a state-operated nursing home in Walla Walla, Washington, where she died 13 years later, blind and unable to care for herself at the age of 100. The small house in Anaconda, Montana had sat vacant even before the confessions from Shoebox Annie. But after around 20 years of vacancy, a new owner purchased the home. The new owner allowed journalists into her new home to show the more interesting aspects of the house, which included bullet holes that were filled with putty, a window that replaces a wall that was riddled with bullets, the backyard that had to be filled every 6 to 8 weeks because it would continuously sink, and a trapdoor in the pantry that contained a box just large enough to hold a dismembered body. When asked if the house was haunted, the new owner said, "Yes, there are a lot of ghosts in it." After this homeowner, the house had several different residents, but was finally bulldozed in 1974. This leads to the questions. Who was the burly man trapped in the room with the woman who got away? What were Annie and Skidmore burning in their copper vat whose smoke smell woke the neighbors and hung in the air for hours and hours? Were there more murders than the 4 that were confirmed and confessed to? The haunted house of mysteries may still be holding on to some secrets, but we'll never know. And that's the story of Shoebox Annie and her son, C.C. Skidmore. Now, I know what you're thinking. Seattle and Pocatello don't have populations of under 15,000, even at the time of the crimes, but the story began in Anaconda, Montana, so I think I'll let it slide. If you have any recommendations for cases, please go to the show's Instagram page, @Crime on the Clarkfork, and in the bio there's a link where you can suggest cases you want to see covered. See you next time!